Welcome back to Earthly Delights, my friends. If you love growing food, caring for soil, discovering useful plants, or simply looking at your garden and wondering, what else is hiding here that I've never noticed? Today's story is for you. Because this is not just a story about flower, it is a story about roots, resilience, forgotten crops, and the quiet wisdom buried beneath our feet. For most of our lives, we have been told that bread began with wheat, that civilization began when humans planted grain, that flour means fields of golden wheat, tractors, fertilizers, and annual harvests. But in 2010, researchers studied ancient grinding stones from sites in southern Italy, Russia, and the Czech Republic. These stones were about 30,000 years old, and inside their tiny cracks, scientists found preserved starch grains and clear wear marks from grinding. That means our ancestors were making flour long before the first wheat fields ever existed. And here's the part that changes everything. That flour did not come from wheat, barley, or any grain at all. It came from roots. One of those forgotten plants was likely cattail, the wetland plant many of us have seen standing quietly in ditches, ponds, and marshes. And beside it stands another powerful root crop, cassava, a tropical plant that now feeds millions and is becoming part of a massive global industry. As gardeners, growers, homesteaders, and people who care about real food, this should make us pause. Because while modern agriculture depends heavily on annual planting, purchased seeds, fertilizers, and fragile grain systems, these root crops tell a different story. They can survive harsh conditions. They can produce huge amounts of food. Some can grow where other crops struggle, and many have been ignored simply because they do not fit neatly into the modern industrial food system. So today, we are going to uncover the idea of infinite flour. Flour from roots, not grains. We will look at cattail, cassava, climate resilience, safe preparation, and what these plants can teach us about gardening, food security, and caring for the land. Before we dig deeper, make sure to subscribe to Earthly Delights, because this is where we explore the plants, soil, and forgotten wisdom that can change the way we grow and eat. Part 1. The Wild Survivor, the Cattail Flower Paradigm. Let's begin with the root that may have helped feed our Ice Age ancestors, the cattail. You have probably seen it many times, standing quietly near ponds, ditches, marshes, or wet fields. To most people, it looks like a simple wetland weed. But to people who understood the land deeply, cattail was never just a weed. Indigenous communities across North America, including the Apache and the Navajo, used cattail rhizomes as an important source of carbohydrates for generations. Similar knowledge also appeared in parts of Australia and South America. And when you look at cattail from a grower's point of view, the numbers are almost unbelievable. A study in New York found that 1 acre of cattails could produce about 140 tons of rhizomes. Once processed, that same acre could yield around 6,475 pounds of flour in a year. Now compare that with wheat. 1 acre of wheat may produce only about 200 to 400 pounds of flour. That means cattail can produce many times more flour from the same land. For gardeners, homesteaders, and anyone who cares about soil, water, and food security, that should make us stop and think. This is a plant that grows in wet places where many crops would fail. It does not need careful irrigation. It does not need yearly replanting. It spreads through its underground rhizomes and keeps returning season after season. Nutritionally, cattail is also more impressive than most people realize. Its rhizomes can contain up to 70% starch by dry weight, with a caloric value close to wheat flour. It also offers useful nutrients such as manganese, vitamin K, magnesium, and dietary fiber. So why don't we see cattail flour in every store? The answer is not because the plant is useless. The answer is because it does not fit easily into the modern industrial food system. Today's seed and chemical industries depend on farmers buying seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and inputs year after year. Cattail does the opposite. It grows freely, spreads naturally, and thrives in wet soil without much help from us. A plant that keeps feeding people without needing to be purchased again and again is powerful for communities, but not very attractive to industries built on repeat sales. And history made the problem worse. Large areas of wetlands were drained to make room for crops like wheat and corn. Cattail, once a useful food plant, was pushed aside and treated as a nuisance. The root was not simply forgotten. Much of its habitat was destroyed. Part 2. The tropical titan, unearthing cassava. While cattail was pushed to the edges of wetlands, another powerful root was fighting its own battle in the tropics. That root is cassava, also known as yucca or manioc. Cassava was domesticated around 10,000 years ago in the Amazon basin. Long before European contact, it helped support great cultures, including the Mayans and the Taino. For people living in tropical regions, cassava was not a backup food. It was a reliable, resilient, life-sustaining crop. But when colonists arrived, they brought more than ships and tools. They brought their own ideas about which foods were civilized and which were not. Wheat was treated as the noble bread of the old world, while cassava was often dismissed as an inferior crop of indigenous and colonized people. That old bias did not disappear completely. It shaped food systems for centuries and created a hierarchy where imported wheat was often valued more than local root crops that actually grew better in the climate. In modern times, this tension appeared clearly in what some call the bread wars. In Nigeria, the government pushed bakeries to replace 10% to 20% of imported wheat flour with locally produced cassava flour. The goal was simple: support local farmers, reduce dependence on foreign grain, and strengthen food sovereignty. But the global wheat industry did not welcome that shift. Wheat was marketed as the superior product, and price pressure made it harder for cassava flour to compete. Still, cassava could not be ignored forever. Today, this tough tropical shrub feeds more than 800 million people around the world. It grows where many crops struggle. It gives families a dependable source of calories. And its market is expanding rapidly, with projections reaching more than $200 billion by 2034. For anyone who grows food, studies soil, or thinks seriously about the future of farming, cassava carries an important lesson. Sometimes the crops that were dismissed as poor, simple, or old-fashioned are actually the crops best prepared for the future. Part 3. Botanical resilience, the climate-proof pantry. So what makes these roots so important for the future of gardening, farming, and food security? The answer is resilience. Unlike wheat, rice, or corn, which must be harvested within a narrow window, cassava gives growers something very different: time. Its roots can stay alive underground for up to 3 years without spoiling. For a family, a small farm, or a village, that means the soil itself becomes a living pantry. When drought hits, many grain crops quickly weaken, dry out, and fail. But cassava has a deeper survival strategy. Its roots reach down for hidden moisture, while the plant can shed leaves and slow its growth to save energy. Above ground, it may look tired, but below ground, the starchy roots remain protected. This is why cassava can grow in acidic, poor soils where other crops need heavy fertilizer just to survive. It produces a large amount of food energy from land that many farmers would consider difficult. And this is the question we should ask as gardeners and growers. In a world of stronger heat, longer droughts, and unpredictable weather, why do we keep depending only on fragile crops? Maybe the future is not just in perfect fields of grain, but in tough roots like cassava and cattail that know how to work with the land instead of fighting against it. Part 4. The science of survival, toxicology, and detoxification. But there is one important truth we cannot ignore. Some of nature's strongest survivors protect themselves well. With cassava, that protection is chemical. Raw cassava roots and leaves contain natural compounds called cyanogenic glycosides, especially linamarin. When the plant is crushed, chewed, or damaged, these compounds can release hydrogen cyanide. Without proper preparation, cassava can be dangerous. This is why knowledge matters. In 2017, in Kasese District, Uganda, a cassava poisoning outbreak hospitalized 98 people and caused 2 deaths after flour from wild cassava was not properly detoxified. But long before modern factories, indigenous communities had already learned how to make cassava safe. Through grating, soaking, fermenting, pressing, and sun-drying, they found ways to draw the toxins into water and let the cyanide escape into the air. Today, this old wisdom has been turned into modern processing. To make high-quality cassava flour, or HQCF, harvested roots must be processed quickly because cassava can begin to spoil within 24 to 48 hours. The roots are washed, peeled, rasped into a slurry, rinsed, pressed, and dried with fast hot air. The result is a clean, white, mild flour with cyanide levels below the safety limit of 10 parts per million. What began as a dangerous raw root becomes a safe, useful, gluten-free flour with enormous potential in the kitchen. Part 5. Baking without gluten, the culinary magic and troubleshooting. Now let's bring this powerful root out of the field and into the kitchen. Cassava flour has become popular because it fits so well with the clean, simple way many people want to eat today. It is naturally gluten-free, grain-free, and nut-free. For anyone who cannot use wheat, or for families trying to avoid common allergens, that makes cassava flour extremely useful. It also has a mild, neutral flavor. Unlike some alternative flours that taste strong, bitter, or nutty, cassava flour behaves much closer to all-purpose flour in everyday cooking. That is why so many home bakers are drawn to it. But if you have ever baked gluten-free bread, muffins, or cake and ended up with something dry, crumbly, dense, or gummy in the middle, you know this flour needs respect. The reason is simple. Cassava flour is mostly starch, around 76.4%, and it contains no gluten. In wheat flour, gluten forms a stretchy protein network that traps air and gives bread that soft, lifted texture. Cassava cannot do that on its own. It also absorbs more liquid than wheat and can thicken at lower temperatures. That means your batter may look fine at first, but later become too dry, or the center may stay wet and heavy while the outside is already baked. So here's how to work with it wisely. First, use a kitchen scale whenever possible. Cassava flour is dense and settles easily. 1 cup can weigh differently depending on how tightly it is packed. If you do not have a scale, use the spoon and level method so you do not add too much flour. Second, let the batter rest for 5 to 10 minutes before baking. This gives the starch time to absorb moisture evenly and helps prevent a gritty or uneven texture. Third, consider baking slightly hotter. Instead of 350 degrees Fahrenheit, try around 375 degrees Fahrenheit for some recipes. This helps the outside set faster and reduces that heavy, gummy center. And finally, give the flour a binder. Since there is no gluten, you need something to hold the crumb together. Xanthan gum can help, but in a home kitchen, an extra egg, a little applesauce, or some nut butter can also make the final texture softer and more tender. Once you understand this, cassava flour stops being tricky. It becomes a flexible, useful ingredient that connects ancient roots with modern kitchens. Part 6. Global traditions to your kitchen table. And when you cook with cassava, you are not just using another gluten-free flour. You are stepping into a long, global food tradition. In South America, cassava has deep cultural roots. In Brazil, it gives us pão de queijo, those chewy, naturally gluten-free cheese breads made with cassava starch. It also gives us farofa, toasted cassava flour cooked with butter, onions, or spices, often sprinkled over meals for flavor and crunch. Move across the ocean to West Africa, and cassava becomes gari, a fermented and roasted food that can be eaten dry, soaked, or turned into iba, a thick, comforting paste served with soups and stews. Cassava is also pounded and shaped into fufu, a filling staple that has supported millions of people for generations. In Asia, cassava appears in sweets, desserts, and one of the most famous modern treats, tapioca pearls. Yes, the chewy boba in bubble tea comes from cassava starch. And we should not forget cattail. Foragers still harvest cattail rhizomes from wet soil, clean away the fibers, and extract a white starch that can be used in flatbreads, pancakes, and simple rustic recipes. In early summer, even the yellow pollen from cattail flower heads can be collected and used as a protein-rich addition to baking. This is the beauty of these plants. They are not just survival foods, they are cultural foods, practical foods, and garden lessons. They remind us that useful ingredients do not always come from perfect fields or expensive systems. Sometimes they come from roots, wetlands, poor soils, and plants most people walk past without a second glance. Infinite food has been hiding in plain sight all along. Part 7. The Earthly Delights Philosophy. Harvesting Lessons for Today. So what does the story of cattail and cassava mean for us today? For the modern gardener, the home baker, the small farmer, and anyone who cares about healthier soil and stronger food systems, these roots carry a powerful lesson. For centuries, much of modern agriculture has tried to force the earth to serve fragile annual grains. We drained wetlands, weakened living soils, depended heavily on chemicals, and slowly forgot the plant wisdom that indigenous communities had protected for generations. But the earth has not forgotten. The plants are still here, waiting in marshes, poor soils, tropical fields, and overlooked corners of the landscape. Cattail still rises from the water. Cassava still stores food underground. And both remind us that true food security does not always come from a perfect field of wheat. Sometimes it comes from a root that can wait patiently in the soil for years. Sometimes it comes from a plant that thrives where other crops fail. Sometimes it comes from what we once dismissed as a weed, a poor person's crop, or a plant not worthy of attention. As gardeners and growers, we need to look again. The future of food may not only depend on bigger machines or more chemicals. It may depend on learning from plants that already know how to survive. By embracing these infinite flowers, we are not just choosing a different ingredient. We are choosing resilience, less waste, stronger local food systems, and a deeper respect for the land that feeds us. Conclusion. The next time you bake with cassava flour, or the next time you pass a marsh filled with cattails moving in the wind, remember those ancient grinding stones from 30,000 years ago. Remember that long before modern wheat fields, our ancestors were already turning roots into food. And remember that the earth still holds many answers beneath the surface. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever baked with cassava flour? Have you ever seen cattails growing near your home, your garden, or a local pond? And would you ever be curious enough to learn how people once turned that wild root into flour? If this story opened your eyes, please hit the like button, subscribe to Earthly Delights, and share this video with a gardener, baker, or food lover who would enjoy discovering the forgotten wisdom of roots. Until next time, keep growing, keep questioning, and keep noticing the quiet miracles hiding right beneath your feet. Stay rooted, everyone.